Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, May 15th, 2026. I'm your host, Brianne Doyle. rabble.ca shares the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week on Rabble Radio, Thomas Ponniah joins Rabble editor Nick Seebruch to talk about the heavy influence of the U.S. on the world stage. They break down why massive military power hasn't led to better quality of life in the States and how a better future is possible. Here are Nick and Thomas in conversation. Take a listen.
Dr. Ponniah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of Rabble.
Today we'll be talking about U.S. hegemony and imperialism, especially within the context of what we are seeing with the current Trump administration. So, Thomas, would you like to get us started on this, quite large and interesting subject?
Well, I think, yes. What I think is interesting about U.S. hegemony is we periodically have people saying the U.S. is in decline.
Mm-hmm.
Every time there's an economic crisis, OPEC 1973, financial crisis 2008, essentially when inflation increases and interest rates increase. And every time when there's a military crisis, Korea 1951, Vietnam 1974, initially Iraq 2023, Afghanistan 2021, and now, of course, Iran 2026. Every time we have one of these crises, the declinists step in and start saying the U.S. is in decline. Now, the problem with this is since we've been hearing this decline story for over 75 years, the question is, why hasn't it declined?
Mm-hmm.
Why does it keep returning as strong as ever? And I think there's 4 or 5 reasons for that. And so let me begin with the first. I mean, like any good progressive, the first thing I look to is follow the money, right? I mean, that's not the last point, but it's always it should be the first point for us. What is it about the U.S. economy that keeps it dominant? And the issue here is U.S. economic productivity. For the last 50 years, the U.S. has consistently produced 20 to 25% of global GDP.
Mm-hmm.
That's an incredible statistic.
Absolutely.
Right? Imagine, for example, say Vladimir Guerrero Jr. was hitting 20% of all the Blue Jays home runs, accounting for 20% of all the RBIs, scoring 20% of the runs, and doing this for 50 years. I mean, that is what the U.S. can do. That is the power of its economy. The world economy has increased, depending on how you measure it, anywhere from 4-fold to 10-fold in the last 50 years. The U.S. consistently produces 20 to 25% of that GDP, right? Out of 200 countries, it can do that. That's an unbelievable statistic.
And it's an incredible concentration of wealth as well when you consider global population and the U.S.'s percentage of that global population.
Yes, exactly, right? 3% of the global population producing this much wealth, right? And what that does, that economic productivity, is it translates militarily.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. spends more money on military defense/war every year than the next 9 biggest spenders combined. The U.S. is spending more than China, India, Saudi Arabia, UK, France, on and on, combined. So how do you match that? This allows the U.S. to have a network of 750 military bases around the world. China has 1 military base and a naval facility in Myanmar. There is no comparison to what the U.S. can do militarily. And then along with that military, part of that military is its satellite surveillance technology.
Mhm.
If the US wants to find you, it will find you. You can hide in a hole in Iraq or hide in a mansion in Pakistan, and eventually the US will find you, right? So this kind of power, consistent power, is very difficult to overthrow, right? And this is why they are able, whatever the economic or political crisis or military crisis, they are able to return to the center, right?
And I'm glad that we're starting with this discussion around the persistency of American global power and imperialism, because as we're talking right now, the U.S. president is in China. It was reported, I believe, in the New York Times this week that China views the U.S. as an empire trying to prevent decline, that's trying to hold on to its power, and that explains some of the imperialist behavior that we've seen in recent years and recent months, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran. So I guess to get to my next question is this, given the consistency of US power over the years, is what we're seeing in recent months under the second Trump administration really different from previous eras of US imperialism?
On one hand, it's very consistent in the sense, now, of course, I wouldn't necessarily use the word imperialism with the US, and I'll explain why. I'm happy to explain that a little later, but let's say US hegemony. I mean, on one hand, Trump is just the latest extension of the Reagan neoliberal revolution. This is neoliberalism continuing, amplifying. On the other hand, what's interesting about this is historically, Americans don't see themselves as imperialists. They see themselves as anti-imperialist. They see themselves as having broken from the British Empire, of having helped dismantle the British Empire throughout the 20th century, as having defeated the Nazi Empire, and as having caused the collapse of the Soviet Empire. They tend to think of themselves as anti-imperialists. Even their military bases around the world are presented as being there for not as occupation, but as defense, for liberation. Americans see themselves as I lived in the US for 14 years, and I've taught there for 21 years. And it's very clear, Americans see themselves as liberators. They don't see themselves as imperialists. What's interesting, I think, about the Trump moment is him and his team seem to have no problem presenting themselves as an empire, as having some sort of right to intervene. It's very interesting. I mean, in that sense, I think they're a bit different, I think, in this sense from previous American leaders who weren't usually comfortable with the idea of America as empire, at least publicly. But Trump seems to be quite comfortable with that, openly comfortable with that.
So getting into more Canadian issues, because obviously Canada has been wrapped up in this issue of American hegemony, and it's been an inflection point in our relationship with the U.S. Over the past 2 years since Trump returned to office. And we heard last year about threats against Greenland. More recently, the Secretary of War had a map behind him showing so-called Greater North America with an American hegemony spreading across the continent. Is that an aberration, or is that part of this pattern of U.S. hegemony? It's just more nakedly open now.
I think it's more nakedly open. I mean, I think in terms of understanding, like, okay, so when we're analyzing the U.S. and trying to figure out, well, what's the weakness here? And maybe in this sense, how does what's in relation to Canada as well? One thing that's interesting about the US that has happened to no other empire in world history is that in the US, German and Japanese automakers outsource to American workers. Now think about that for a moment. They are outsourcing to American workers because they can pay American workers lower salaries, lower benefits, no pensions, etc., compared to German and Japanese citizens. So the average German or Japanese citizen is living a higher quality of life than the average American worker. And we know this, by the way, if you just look at stats in terms of life expectancy. They have a much higher life expectancy and much higher quality of life than the American worker. Now, why is this interesting to us? Well, whenever in human history have the citizens of the empire, of the conqueror, lived a lower quality of life than the conquered? Germany and Japan were defeated by the US in World War II. Their citizens live a higher quality of life than the American worker. That seems to me to be a recipe for substantial reform or even transformation, right? That's not sustainable. Alongside that, there's a weird situation in which the American super rich have almost disconnected themselves from the American state. They have no relationship to the American state. They have very little relationship to the American state. So in the sense of, in the past, a popular American saying would have been, what's good for General Motors is good for America. That's not the case anymore. What's good for a US corporation isn't good for America. And American workers are realizing this. And so I think that's a huge weakness in the US that will have to be addressed. That's worth pondering and thinking about how Americans will address that and how Canadians will address it. Because we, of course, with Canada, we always see the kind of shadow effect of the US in Canadian politics.
And I think that juxtaposition you just laid out, I think maybe relates to what you were saying earlier about how you wouldn't use necessarily the word imperialism, because a feature of empire is colonies, and that those colonies are the ones getting exploited. The people there are the ones getting exploited. Whereas you point out in the current American system of hegemony, it's the reverse. It's the people at home who experience quite a lot of the exploitation of the workers at the very least.
Yeah. No, and by the way, just say it makes sense that leftists will use the term American empire because, of course, we're always dealing with American interventionism, right? But I think here's the problem with it. The leftists have a tendency to focus on the state. And of course, the MAGA crowd, the far right crowd, focuses on the deeper state, the bureaucracy within the state, focus on the deep state. My own focus would be on the deeper state, which is capitalism. From what I can see, capitalism is the empire of empires. Whether it's the US or China or Germany or the European Union or Japan at the top of the world system, they're going to have to follow the dictates of the capitalist system. And so I think I wouldn't want to lose the focus that the US is in some ways the agent of a bigger system, the capitalist system. And that to me is the real empire that has to be focused, that should be, we should be oriented around.
It's imperialism, but decoupled from a particular specific nation. It's more broad than that, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And the different nations and have to operate within those structures and constraints. And so we shouldn't lose track of that. So, and then when we're constructing alternatives, we have to be very clear on that. Because some people will think, oh, if the US is just weaker, less hegemonic, then we'll have a better world. In fact, that's not the case. I don't think that's the case. That function the US plays will be replaced by someone else. So I think that's where you have to think of a broader analysis.
So the way that capitalism plays within all of this, you feel that informs some of Trump's decisions, that sort of, for some people, kind of came out of left field. The kidnapping of a Venezuelan president, the embargo of Cuba, the oil blockade of Cuba, and then, more recently, the invasion of Iran. That capitalism is an informer to all of these decisions.
Well, the decision to go to Venezuela before Iran is significant. They're both major oil producers. I mean, it's clear why you would want those specific countries to be under your control. Any major capitalist nation would want that, right? So I think that would be that would be part of the reason for that. Now, Iran, of course, is a more complicated case because for the past 30 years, Benjamin Netanyahu has been pushing the U.S. to attack Iran. What's interesting is military advisors to the U.S. to the U.S. president have consistently dissuaded American presidents from attacking Iran. What's interesting is something changed with this presidency. And that's what we're thinking about. What changed here, right? So if you want, I can go into that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, what I would say is, okay, so first of all, when people focus on Jewish Zionism as the kind of agent behind the US intervention in Iran, the danger of that analysis is it can easily fall into anti-Semitism. In the West, the longest hatred in the West has been anti-Semitism. There's no doubt about this, right? And so you've always got to be aware of that. As I point out, for the last 30 years, Netanyahu has pushed for this attack on Iran. And it's not surprising, by the way. Iran, the Iranian regime that came into power, the Islamic Republic, has always been very honest about its desire to overthrow Israel. So it's not surprised that Israelis would be scared of Iran. This is kind of logical and would want defense against Iran or attack Iran, whatever. That's not surprising. What's interesting, I think, this time is that the Gulf states also wanted an attack on Iran. Some of the Gulf states wanted an attack on Iran. They are worried about Iranian regional hegemony. They wanted to neutralize Iran as well. And then thirdly, the people Trump surrounds himself are Christian Zionists. And I think they're the more important factor. They all believe that Israel is going to be the home of the second coming of the Messiah. Israel should be the most powerful player in the Middle East. Iran is the clear threat to Israel. Therefore, any type of trying to dismantle Iran will aid that project. So those three forces, say Netanyahu, some of the Gulf states, and the Christian Zionists that surround Iran, are clear. That surround Iran, surround Trump, are the reasons I think. I mean, of course, you could also add Trump's psychology, but it's hard to know what goes on in a man's heart, right? But what we do know is who he surrounds himself with. And he surrounds himself with a certain group of people who all want Israel to be the most powerful player in the Middle East for their own purposes, not because they want preservation of the Jewish population necessarily.
And of course, also on an economic level, what we were talking about the unique style of US hegemony, where US citizens are on the receiving end of the exploitation. We are seeing the results of this conflict very much raising gas prices, which raises the price of everything else, causing exploitation and more hardship for American workers. But the owners of those companies are doing quite well for themselves, arms companies, oil companies, etc.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is the reason why, at the same time as you have a kind of rise in a kind of fascist populism, you also have the rise or return of a kind of democratic socialism. And this is where I think someone like Bernie Sanders and AOC and Zoran Mamdani and others have been fantastic for the US and maybe for Canada, actually, also, and for the world, in the sense that the affordability agenda is the right agenda at the moment, right? It is the correct starting point. People can't afford their groceries, they can't afford transportation, they can't afford daycare. So therefore you get a leader like Mamdani who pushes for these three things to be addressed, right? So I think that's a great thing, and that offers us a path forward. And now what I would add to it is I wouldn't simply say we need democratic socialism. I would say we need a spiritual democratic socialism, because there's something, it's not just actually, it's not simply capitalism that's the empire, it's consumer capitalism. And that creates a kind of void in people that needs to be addressed. So democratic socialism addresses the problem politically and economically, which I think is great. But there needs to be to address the problem culturally. What I mean by that is when we're trying to imagine a new society, we have to imagine one that not only addresses our material needs, but also our spiritual needs. And right now, we're in a world where American consumer culture dominates the world.
Absolutely, and I feel like we're starting to get to touching on the last phase of our conversation here is responses to U.S. hegemony in the current era. You know, you're talking more broadly about how society can respond. How can Canada respond, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I thought it was great that Avi Lewis has come in with an affordability agenda. I think that agenda is the right agenda. You know, what's interesting, as soon as Avi Lewis was elected, since then, I've noticed Carney's emphasizing a little more the liberal part of the Liberal Party, the progressive part of the Liberal Party. And that's often the case in Canada. If the left is strong, the Liberals move to the left. If the right is strong, the Liberals move to the right. So for leftists, we have to push forward like a kind of innovative agenda. And so in that sense, a democratic socialist agenda that actually addresses people's concrete economic needs would be great. Outside of politics, then I think, addressing, like I said, this kind of spiritual vacuum. People point a lot to some of the problems of the whole manosphere, right? And they're right to. But what they're not understanding is that's also resulting from a kind of spiritual vacuum. People feel meaningless, right? In the mid 20th century, if you were a fascist, a capitalist, or a communist, you emphasized the importance of the worker. The average person was important. And in that time, it was mainly the average male, right? But today, in our politics, we focus a lot on identity and diversity and so on, which I agree with. Obviously, those things are important. But we don't focus as much on just the average person's basic economic needs. Students today, I ask a student, well, what are your dreams for the future? No one says buying a house or buying a condo. They can't even imagine that. That's been wiped out in the big cities. That's a horrible thing that people can't even have their own home, right? However you imagine it. It doesn't have to be private property. It could be like a collective, cooperative home, whatever, but they can't even imagine that, right? So I think, progressives have to come back to that, the importance of that. And that helps explain some of the manosphere stuff. Because a lot of men, if they don't feel they're economically secure, then they don't believe they can have a family because they see themselves as being crucial, having a crucial economic function in a family, right? If they want to have kids and so on. And this kind of stuff hasn't really been recognized, I think, among progressives, what's going on here. So there's a kind of spiritual vacuum, and it's a link to a kind of loss of faith in progress.
Absolutely. And we just have about, a minute left, but Dr. Ponniah, I want to just give you a quick moment to, give us any closing thoughts that you wanted to share.
Like I said, I mean, we're in a society that has material and spiritual needs. We have to think of ways of addressing it. People think that in the secular material society, we don't have spiritual needs. They'll point to the churches. They'll say, look, Sunday morning, the churches are empty. What's interesting is the yoga studios are full and everyone has a mindfulness app. That tells us something. And we have to think about how to address the totality of the human. So I would think that would be something I would aim for. So when we're thinking about American imperialism, not just to think of it as a political economic force, but also as a cultural force. It's something that has to be rethought and reimagined in terms of building a new society, a new world.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was, I think, a great conversation on a very large topic. And listeners, we're going to be covering this topic even more next week on Tuesday, May 19th. Dr. Ponniah will be joining the rest of our expert panel for our next Off the Hill political panel. So please join us as we continue this conversation on American hegemony and American imperialism. It's at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Visit rabble.ca to register for this great discussion. Dr. Ponniah, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, and thanks for the thoughtful questions.
That was Thomas Ponniah and Nick Seebruch in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Thomas and Nick. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. To do that, let's hand things back over to Rabble editor Nick Seebruch. Back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting with national news. Prime Minister Mark Carney is pushing an ambitious plan to revamp Canada's energy sector. This national plan would see the province's separate energy grids become more interconnected. He also plans on doubling Canada's energy capacity by the year 2050. How he plans to do this is raising concerns for the environment and biodiversity. Carney plans on building more pipelines for Alberta crude oil, while also lowering planned increases to the industrial carbon tax. Carney also plans on cutting regulations for future power projects. His new rules would allow power projects to go forward even if they could harm at-risk species if his cabinet ministers deem the project to be in the national interest. Environmental and Indigenous groups have already begun to push back against some of these projects because of the threat that they pose to the climate and to Indigenous land sovereignty. In Labour news, the Canadian Labour Congress held their convention in Winnipeg this week. The convention saw speeches from NDP leaders such as Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi, and, of course, the federal leader, Avi Lewis. The Congress also passed resolutions affirming their commitment to supporting Palestinian rights, environmental protections, and 2S LGBTQIA+ rights. On the fourth day of the convention, delegates took to the streets of Winnipeg to demonstrate in support of Canadian jobs. They want governments to do more to protect workers from the rising threat of tariffs and to ensure job security and affordability. Over 2,000 delegates from dozens of unions and other labor organizations attended this year's convention. Also this week, Lush Cosmetics launched a new partnership with the Animal Alliance of Canada to end the use of dogs and cats in harmful research and testing. The campaign is a part of Lush's Paws Off Our Pets campaign. While Canada made historic strides in 2023 by banning the use of animal testing for cosmetics, companion animals continue to suffer in labs with virtually no oversight, as Canada remains the only G7 country without federal legislation governing the use of animals in science. As always, you can read the full versions of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. To help support our show, please visit rabble.ca/donate, subscribe to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and now join us over on Patreon for special bonus content. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca. Thank you to Carl Nierenberg for supplying the music, and thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and we'll talk to you next week.